This is Viva 5, Week 5 on the early church's worship services. So, although we tend to imagine that the church services have always looked like the ones that we normally experience, in fact, the worship practices of the early church were theologically rich creation which included both the family and were utterly unrecognizable and were very different from what we see today. So the 3 points are that it was rooted in, the early church was rooted in Judaism, and that it was very different from what you might expect from what we do nowadays, and was filled with complex spiritual and theological symbolism. So first, it was rooted in Judaism. The early church was rooted in Judaism, excuse me. So to understand this, you kind of have to know what the term liturgy means. Liturgy means the key to understanding the early church service was that it was arranged in a formal way, which followed specific steps, and these specific steps are called liturgy. So in a way, it was just the organization of how the service went. And so, now that we know that term, we can use it. So the synagogue service liturgy contained a profession of faith, a prayer of 18 blessings, readings from the books of the law and of prophets, and the sermon, and then a priestly blessing at the end. And so, because the people who led the early church were raised in the synagogue, they decided to keep that form of liturgy but changed it to fit more of their needs. And so, the early church their liturgy contained the invocation of the Trinity, prayers of intercession, readings from the Gospel and Apostle writings, a sermon, and then the dismissal of the catechems. Sorry, I'm butchering that word. These people were a group of people that weren't yet Christians. They had to go through a 2-year process. Well, everyone in that day had to go through a 2-year process to become a Christian, and this is because the church wanted to know that their believers were truthful and weren't just wishy-washy and would just go, and because they were being persecuted, they didn't want the wishy-washy Christians to go to the Romans and be like, oh yeah, there's a church over there, you can go attack them, and switch sides. And so then, and also the non-Christian, the Christian trainees in a way, could not also take communion or the Eucharist. And so after they were sent away, all the Christians took the Eucharist, which is also, it is just like a communion. And is also a form of thanksgiving and remembering what Jesus did for us on the cross. Did for them on the cross, excuse me. And at first it was called the Love Feast, but that got a really bad connotation, so then they changed it to the Eucharist. And they had this at every gathering and every celebration. And so over time, after the Christians had a lot of these gatherings, the Romans, of course, became interested in what was happening. And so around 111 AD, Pliny the Younger wanted to know about this new cult. And so he grabbed former leaders, or duchesses, several of them, and tortured them until they gave him what he wanted to hear about this new cult. And so we figured out that the church had services before dawn, they had this thing called the Eucharist, and that the service was like a mini Easter vigil or a sunrise service because Jesus rose in early dawn. So second, the church services were very different than what we experience today. So while nowadays services are somewhat louder, maybe for some churches, the early church was probably even louder. It was disorganized and, like I said, loud. Because people in the middle of service would have a prophecy and so stand up and say it. And people were speaking in tongues. And so the Apostle Paul teaches that it is important that prophets and speakers in tongues should limit their participation so that the service doesn't become too chaotic, unquote.